Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this very special lecture within the House Series of ECPR. Today, we are here together to celebrate the award, the Rising Star Award, given to Hans Asenbaum this year for his early career, research, production, and engagement in the field of deliberative and participatory democracy. My name is Melisa. I'm based at the University of Bremen in Germany, and I will be just chairing and hosting this session and then moderating a little bit the conversation afterwards. But first of all, we will have a presentation by Hans Asenbaum, our rising star, who will be giving us some insight from his latest book, The Politics of Becoming. Before that, and before we get started with Hans's lecture, I want to introduce him for those of you who do not know him yet. Hans is currently a senior research fellow at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Hans received his PhD from the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster, but since then he has held various teaching and research positions across the world. I will just name a few. He has contributed to the Global Participedia project. He has visited at the University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, the Technical University in Berlin, the Finnish Center for Democracy Research in Turku in Finland, and the University of Vienna in Austria. He has taught over a dozen courses. He has published over 15 research articles in international peer-reviewed journals. He has won Best Paper prizes. He has been an associate editor for the Journal of Deliberative Democracy and also served as part of the convening team at the Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Standing Group for the Political Studies Association in the UK. But most recently, Hans not only was promoted to senior research at the Center for Deliberative Democracy in Canberra, but he is also part of the very new team, editorial team, leading the Journal for Deliberative Democracy. So as you can see, and as probably many of you know, Hans has had a very intense and very, very prolific career so far, despite him being evidently very young and very early in his career. So we are sure and certain that he will continue to make invaluable contributions to the field. Among these contributions that are ongoing, I just want to mention one, his democratic theorizing project, where he engaged with Black Lives Matter movement and activists to develop a concept of a theory and a concept of life, if I remember correctly. So please make sure to check out Hans's work, his research paper. Make sure to follow him on Twitter. He's very active there, so you can always follow his latest update. But today, what he will be sharing with us is his latest book, The Politics of Becoming. It has just come out, or is in the process of just coming out, with Oxford University Press, and I will just in a moment paste the link in the chat. It will be open access, so you can also already see the digital version. Hans, I will now hand it over to you for your presentation. You will have about 30-40 minutes to present, and then we will have a round of questions and answers and conversations, hopefully, with the participants in this webinar. So to the participants, please bear in mind, we have different tools to interact with you today. You can leave comments, questions, ideas in the chat if you'd like. But if you have a very concrete comment for our presenter today, for Hans, you can also use the Q&A tool. After Hans's presentation, I will invite any of you who want to join us with camera and audio to also pose your questions live and have a conversation with us. If you don't have questions, but you have a comment or you have ideas that you want to share with Hans based on his presentation, those are also welcome. You don't have to maybe disguise your comments as a question. Comments are also welcome. Please make sure after the presentation to raise your hand. There's a button to raise your hand in the toolbar below, and then we will be able to invite you to join us on the screen. Without further ado, Hans, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa. I'm really humbled by this introduction. It's very kind. I feel like we're all working hard, so we're trying our best. And yeah, I'm grateful to the ECPR for the prize, obviously, but also for the opportunity to speak here. Again, grateful, Melissa, for the introduction, and to all of you for being here and for discussing my forthcoming book with you, for your interest. And I hope we have a lively conversation afterwards. So I'm just going to present a little bit the ideas of the book, and then we'll go into the discussion. And as you can hopefully see, the cover of the book is very colorful. The book is about identities and possibilities for identity change, for self-transformation in democracy, in radical democratic politics. So as Melissa mentioned, also the book is open access. You can already access it. There is a link in the chat. So please go and download your own copy if you're interested in the book. So the open access has been made possible by various organizations: the Austrian Organization for Political Science, Society for Political Science, Participedia, the PDD group, Participatory and Deliberative Democracy group of the PSA, the Center for Deliberative Democracy, my own home, and the University of Canberra's Faculty for Business, Government and Law. And I'm very grateful for their contributions to making this book open access and accessible to all of you. So let's start from my understanding of democracy. What I'm interested in is, I call it radical democracy, but mostly what I mean, or what I'm interested in, is the spaces where people actually physically come together to engage in democratic politics, right? And there are these various spaces. There are more traditional parliaments, but there are also the social movement spaces where people claim spaces. And then there are citizens' assemblies, participatory budgets, all these kinds of democratic innovations. So I'm interested in this lively understanding of democracy and in the physical presence of people here. So this is also the point of departure of the book, because in the 1990s, there was a vivid discourse, a feminist-led discourse in democratic theory that talked about the politics of presence. So exactly the importance of physically being present, engaging in politics together. And the argument here, led by many, such as Jane Mansbridge, Iris Marion Young, and Anne Phillips, of course, was that particularly marginalized groups, so those who carry identities that are connected to marginalization, discrimination, they need to step into the public sphere, what Hannah Arendt calls the space of appearance. They need to actively appear and draw attention to their bodies, draw attention to their identities in order to fight this kind of marginalization. So an active identity politics as a tool towards equality and inclusion in democracy. And we have seen in the past that this kind of identity politics really works and has a huge impact on societies, right? So if we look back at the suffragette movement, the early women's movement here, stepping into the space of appearance, stepping into the public sphere and drawing attention to their embodied identities, and in so doing, really moving towards big changes in society. Much more recently, we can see that in slut walks, where again, it's a very gendered identity that is being performed in the public sphere to challenge rape culture. And again, also in the Me Too movements, we can see how these movements have large impacts on society and really cause societal transformations. And the Black Lives Matter movement, also a more recent example, here drawing attention to racial identity, to again have big impact on society and have real policy change. So we can see that this politics, this identity politics, or the politics of presence, really works, right? But, and this is also pointed out by the feminist discourse in the 1990s, there's also a problem with this kind of identity politics, with the politics of presence. And Iris Marion Young has called this problem the dilemma of difference. So in stepping into the public sphere and drawing attention to our marginalized identities, we also tend to essentialize ourselves, right? These active performances have essentializing tendencies, they in a way also encourage stereotyping, and we're putting ourselves into boxes by engaging in this kind of identity politics. So if you will, identity politics for democracy works to expand equality, but it limits freedom. It limits the freedom of self-expression. It limits the freedom to live the multiple sides that we all carry in ourselves. And that exactly is the problem the book engages with. So that's the dilemma that the book discusses in every chapter. And here my answer to the politics of presence and the dilemma of difference is the politics of becoming. Here I borrow a term and further develop a term originally coined by William Colony. He talked about the politics of becoming as a performative act of producing our identities actively in the public sphere. So I make the argument that we all have multiple selves. We all are multiple inside, and we can express and need to express this multiplicity. And it's a democratic freedom to express this multiplicity. I talk about the fugitive self. So what we perform in the public sphere is the kind of captured version of ourselves, the continuous version of ourselves that societies require us to present. But inherently, we're actually multiple. So our selves are always fugitive. They're actually always on the run, trying to escape the societal limitations that are imposed by societies. So in making this argument, and I will unpack it throughout this talk, in making this argument, I do not challenge the politics of presence, or I do not contest the politics of presence, but I see this as an augmentation or a further development of the politics of presence. So my idea here is that the politics of presence is always inherently performative. We just need to explore further this performativity in order to free the multiple self. And I want to maintain this quality of identity politics as making an argument, an embodied argument for inclusion and equality, while also pairing this kind of equality with the freedom of the subject to change. So this is the challenge the book faces. How can we keep identity politics, or reread, re-understand, and also develop new practices of identity politics that allow for inclusion and equality, but also for expressing our inner multiplicity? So let's start to unpack this idea of the politics of presence. And here I feel the work of Moya Lloyd is foundational. In her book Beyond Identity Politics, she makes a crucial argument, and that is that we never step into the public sphere, we never engage in democracy with pre-established identities. Our identities are not pre-given, they're always produced in the process of democratic engagement. So our identities are always inherently performative. We often choose to perform our identities in a continuous way, but they're actually always transformational. And that is also what William Colony argues for with his original concept of the politics of becoming. He actually looks at identity politics. He looks at the women's movement, the gay rights movement, as he calls it, right? The gay and lesbian rights movement at this time, and the civil rights movement. And he says that these people who engage in this kind of identity politics, they are always already engaging in self-transformation because they're performing themselves as who they want to be, as who they want to be seen in the future, rather than as who they are seen as now. So through this lens, let's look again at the examples that I briefly showed before. We can see that the suffragette movement doesn't perform women essentially as women, but here these women step into the public sphere as the future voters, as the future politicians they want to be seen as. So they actively perform a version of themselves that they want to be seen as, and that they hopefully will be in the near future. If we look at slut walks, again, we can see a certain kind of identity politics. There is a carnivalesque moment here, right? There's these women perform a certain version of their self in this very instance. This is not how they might, go to work or perform their identities in other spaces. There's a kind of masquerade happening in identity politics already. And if we look here at the Black Lives Matter movement, again, the protest against the killing and murder of Trayvon Martin, a 7-year-old boy who was walking from a convenience store with Skittles in his hand and with a hoodie over his head, and who was then killed by a neighborhood watchman. And his hoodie was made responsible for him looking suspicious. These people in these protests, in the Million Hoodie March, we can see, take to the streets not as any kind of identity, but they all use the hoodie to perform a certain version of themselves, to express solidarity with the victim of this murder. So we can see that there's always a moment of becoming already inherent in the classic kind of identity politics, in the politics of presence. But I want to take this understanding further and really deeply engage with this idea of self-transformation and performing the multiple self in radical democratic politics. And here I draw on assemblage theory, and the idea of assemblage is so important here. This draws on new materialist thinking that basically says that we can analyze everything as an assemblage. Everything is made of various components that somehow affect each other directly or indirectly. Everything has a certain kind of texture, a certain kind of materiality, even if it's a discursive concept. It has its own texture, its own materiality, and it affects everything else, right? So let's take this kind of assemblage thinking as a starting point and engage with spaces first, democratic spaces, because they give rise to different identities. And then let's engage with identities and think about what it means to think about identities in assemblage term. And this will allow us to develop this idea of a politics of becoming and this kinds of self-transformation in democratic politics. So if we look at democratic spaces again, I said there are the more classic closed spaces of parliaments where people physically get together and do politics, do democracy. There are invited spaces such as citizens' assemblies, participatory budgets, where often state agency or powerful organizations invite people into a participatory space. And then there are claimed spaces where social movement claims spaces bottom up and institutionalized to a certain extent, very vague understanding or soft understanding of institutions, their own rules, their own democratic space here. So these are the kind of democratic spaces I want to talk about and look at them through the assemblage lens. And here the work of Hannah Arendt is really crucial because she allows us to understand spaces and their connections to identity in a completely different way. Originally, we might primarily think of spaces as something very physical, the material surroundings. But Arendt makes a very different argument here. And she says the space of appearance comes into being where men, sick here, are together in the manner of speech and action. So the sig only refers to the gender because she actually talks about humans in the German original. But what I'm trying to show here is that Arendt actually produces an understanding of space as something lived, something where the bodies of humans, potentially maybe also non-humans, come together and create a social kind of space. So I take this as a starting point and develop an understanding of spaces by looking through assemblage lenses and try to understand what are actually the different things, the different materialities that constitute this kind of a social, a democratic space. Now, I argue that once they are constituted by the actual material objects. So here is a classic of understanding of space as the relationality between material things. But then there are also the sentient bodies, and that is what Arendt draws our attention to, right? Spaces are constituted by the sentient bodies, be they human or non-human, that assemble in that space, and by their social relations between them. The different emotions that people have towards each other constitute how we understand how we perceive this kind of space, how we experience this kind of space. And then the spatial configurations also depend on the performative expressions of the humans and non-humans, of the sentient bodies that assemble here. Whatever they say, whatever they express, they perform also non-verbally, reconstitutes that space in ever new ways. So we can see here is a lived understanding of space as an assemblage that is in itself always becoming. And that is so crucial to understand, because these kind of transformative spaces also give rise to our own transformative identities. And this is the link that Hannah Arendt talks about when she talks about the space of appearance, the spatial surroundings, the spatial structures that are always themselves becoming give rise to our identities. So what does that mean for identities, for the politics of becoming, and for this understanding of self-transformation? Let's look at identities themselves as assemblages, and let's analyze, right? Assemblage theory is an analytical tool that lets us understand the different components that assemble in a certain space. So what are our identities actually made of? We can first think very materially. What are the material components of democratic subjects of our identities? And here we have the bones, the hairs, the muscles, the blood cells, the hormones that circulate through our bodies. We have the bacteria, the fungi, the viruses. So the living organisms that actually live in our bodies, that inhabit our bodies. So we can already see that we're not this kind of fixed unit, but our physical bodies are inhabited by different organisms. Then there is food, there are medicines, microplastics that we drink in our water that circulate through our bodies. So even when we just look at the very material things that constitute our bodies, we can already start to get an understanding of our bodies as something very transformative and always in motion. But then there are also the discursive concepts of race, of sexuality, of gender, age, class, and so on, that we the discursive artifacts that we produce and attach to our identities, that we use to describe our identities. Then there are the culturally coded and gendered social protocols, how we act, how society teaches us to express our bodies, to express our body language, our mimicry, our facial expressions. Then there are our opinions, our views, our desires that are such a crucial part of our identities. And again, materially, there are the clothes, the makeup that we choose. So we can see that our identities are made up of many different things, some of them more, some of them less material, but all made of different textures, and some of them more fixed and others of them more selective, if you will, right? So once we start to analyze these different components of our identities, we can start thinking about how our identities can be transformed by rearranging these kind of assemblages. And here, the Rancièrean idea of interruption is really important and crucial in the book as well. So Rancière is mainly interested in the democratic function of interruption. Interruption can have negative or anti-democratic functions as well, but he focuses on freedom and equality interrupting the police order, right? So the order that governs us can be democratically interrupted by freedom and equality. And I'm interested in these kind of interruptions. How can we interrupt our stable assemblages that we continuously perform in the public sphere? Can we have moments of interruption here to reassemble us or reassemble ourselves temporarily? Rancière then talks about disidentification. So we can interrupt our identities, we can interrupt the police order and disidentify from the identities that are given to us. He talks about how the police order gives us certain names, right? And this politics of naming is a politics of managing our identities, making us traceable, surveilling the democratic subjects. And disidentification allows us to distance ourselves from the identities that are given to us by this police order. So this all is very abstract, and I will make it more concrete. Rancière then says we can interrupt identities, we can interrupt the police order through improper names. And here he suggests collectives such as the 99% as a moniker that gives us a little bit of anonymity, right? That if we get together with other people, if we submerge ourselves in a crowd, in a multitude, as Harden Negri would say, then we can become part of a bigger collective democratic subject here. And the 99% as an example of the Occupy movement give us a little bit of anonymity and allow us to produce a new identity by joining this collective. Now, there's some democratic potential here, of course, but it is also problematic because it tells us in a way that in order to self-transform, we need to join a collective. But that collective also rules our identities in its own way. So how can we individually self-transform? And here I draw on queer theory, and in particular on intersectional and Black queer theory, to understand identity transformation on a more personal level, because queer theory often tells very personal stories of self-transformation. José Esteban Munoz also talks about disidentification, uses the same term as Rancière, and also talks about how people can reject the identities given by the dominant order through disidentifying, through developing our own identities here. But he tells these stories, he tells the understanding or develops a concept of disidentification through the personal stories of self-transformations of queer people, of trans people who reject the gender identities given to them. And we can further examine or develop these ideas through Marquis Bey, who proposes Black trans feminism as a way of abolishing identity altogether. So Bey draws on abolitionism, the idea of abolishing slavery, abolishing prison, the prison societies of today, and develops this further by thinking about how can we abolish our punitive attitudes, right? We are living in societies that are based on punishment, on punishing others, on punishing ourselves, by confining ourselves by certain given identities that also produce certain hierarchies. So how can we abolish identities, overcome identities, and draw on fugitivity, right? The experience of being fugitive, of transing boundaries. So transing the boundaries both of states, of governments that rule us, but also transing the boundaries of gender, transing the boundaries of identities, and in so doing, exploring the multiple self. And Bey argues that this needs, for this, that's not an individualistic idea. For this, it needs societies that love us, that support us, and that never expect us to be a certain version when we show up, right? That always allows us, affords us the freedom to show up in a new way. So all of this may sound quite abstract. Let's talk a bit more practically. How can we practice this identification in radical democratic politics? Here, of course, anonymity comes to mind, and I've mentioned it already, and Rancière alludes to anonymity as well. And we can see how the mask, both online and offline as a physical thing, can work as this kind of a moniker that produces a collective identity here in the case of the anonymous movement. But of course, we easily can see that anonymity can have both democratic and anti-democratic functions, and can work in democratic and anti-democratic ways, here exemplified by the Pussy Riot movement, who contests an anti-democratic and authoritarian regime in Russia by using anonymity, and on the other hand, the Ku Klux Klan, who engages in hate crime, in racial violence and murder, again using anonymity. So how can we make sense of these contradictions of anonymity and their democratic and anti-democratic functions? I argue that anonymity is always inherently contradictory, and we cannot overcome these contradictions. We can only try to focus on the positive effects of anonymity in democracy, and we can try to avoid the negative effects. Anonymity affords inclusion and exclusion. So it both creates a more leveled playing field by hiding temporarily the hierarchies of our everyday identities. And at the same time, it allows us to engage in hate crime and in building new hierarchies, in building new exclusions. It allows for subversion and submission. So thinking about the Pussy Riot movement, it allows us to subvert, to challenge established hierarchies. But at the same time, anonymity allows us to submit to the dominant order, to dominant dynamics, and more easily give in to strong leadership. Anonymity also allows for honesty and deception. It allows us to more freely speak our mind in democracy, but it also allows us to deceive, to create fake identities, to create fake news, and so on. So we can see that anonymity is always contradictory, but it has potentially some positive effects for democracy. So of course, in the digital age, anonymity becomes much more prevalent and much more accessible. If you think about the communication tools that are necessary for anonymity, anonymity is now in our pockets every day. So let's think through how spaces are reconfigured through online communication, and then again, how our identities are reconfigured through digital communication. In the 1990s, the early understandings and conceptions of cyberspace were very much focused on this idea of these democratic ideals of freedom and equality that the online anonymity affords, right? We all go online and we leave our hierarchies behind by becoming pure code, basically, by expressing ourselves in text only. Nobody can judge us. And we can all be equal on the internet. And these ideas of cyber democracy in the 1990s were really connected to this idea of disembodiment. We leave the bodies, we leave our identities, we leave all the troubles that are connected to our bodies, also all the pains of our bodies behind, and we submerge in this online sphere of freedom and equality. And of course, these ideas have been aptly criticized and further developed in recent discourses, and we know that things are not that easy, and many of the hierarchies are reproduced in online space. And I think one of the problems of these ideas of online space is that we forget about the materiality of online space. Everybody participating online is always also located in some physical offline space. Online space is not purely online. It is always hybrid. So we are located in our homes, in our bedrooms, in public cafes, in offices, in parks, or at gyms when we're communicating online. So instead of thinking of online space as a sphere that happens only on the screen, I invite you to think about digital space is something that has very strong material components beyond, of course, the material architecture, the material infrastructure of online communication. We can also think about these physical spaces where we all are located, and they all come together. They're all are connected online in these kind of assemblages that are very material assemblages and not digital assemblages purely. And of course, they are connected to all our physical identities as well. Our physical identities matter, and they do transform through our online communications in a very organic manner, I actually think. Rather than thinking about who we are online, we need to think materially about the digital devices that now enter our identity assemblages, right? The assemblages that I've sketched out earlier that include, for example, clothing, makeup, all these accessories. They now also include the smartphones that we carry in our pockets, smart watches, all the different screens that we surround ourselves with now become a material object as part of our identity assemblages, one that is very personal and that we are very personally are connected to. Sherry Turkle, already very early in 1984, argues that these objects, before smart devices existed, of course, she said, computers are evocative objects because they call us in certain ways. They call on us. And these evocative objects now become part of our assemblages, and they function as mirrors. but not objective mirrors, of course. They function as mirrors that give us some freedom in how we constitute ourselves, but that are also problematically capitalist products, right? They're a part of a capitalist economy that call on us in a certain way, that co-constitute our identities in a certain way. Increasingly, we start to see the world through the digital, right? We become socialized by digital devices. If you think about YouTube becoming a co-parent to our children's, or us looking at the world increasingly through the digital and being socialized and now rereading our own physical bodies through these digital interpretations, right? All the digital identity constitutions that we encounter, they make us read our offline identities differently. And indeed, they become hybrid identities because we cannot separate the digital from the physical or analog anymore, because we now reinterpret what is offline through what we have learned and how we've been socialized online. And in this sense, in a very real way, we are becoming cyborgs, right? So what Donna Haraway also already wrote about in the 1980s is something very real, not in the sense of only digital devices being actual physical body parts, but in the sense of how we reread reality and how we allow these evocative objects to become very intimate parts of our identity assemblages. So this may have many problematic components for democracy, for society, and we can talk about this in the discussion. But here I explore the positive, the democratic components. What can these self-transformations contribute to a new kind of politics of presence, a digital politics of presence, one that faces this challenge of allowing for identity politics, allowing for a politics of presence that expresses our identities, but at the same time allows us to live our multiple self, to express our inner multiplicity, to show up differently if we feel like showing up differently, to transform as part of a politics of becoming. I'm going to give 3 very brief examples before I close this talk. So at the beginning of the Occupy movement actually stands a website, a blog that invited everybody who wanted to participate to take selfies, upload these selfies, and write on a piece of paper about your social condition, about your precarity, right? And people just expressed their identities through selfies here, and they partly used anonymity by, not showing all of their face. But in any case, they always had some agency over showing a certain angle of themselves, showing a certain version of themselves in this particular participatory space. So we have a woman who is pregnant, 21-year-old, who is scared about the future because she cannot afford health insurance. A man who already had cancer surgery and who shows his scar from the surgery, also cannot afford health insurance in the US, a man who says who is obese and who is unemployable. So we can see here that this is an identity politics, right? That is a very active engagement in showing marginalized identities, but doing that in a very embodied way. So not at all in a disembodied way, as the early cyber democracy discourse argued, but in a very embodied way, which is at the same time self-transformative because it allows for some agency over self-presentation. In another example, the Habbo Hotel riot, here Habbo Hotel is a social media environment, a hotel environment, an identity play environment where you create your own avatar and you engage socially with other people on this social media platform in this kind of role play game. And it's mainly used by US American, North American teens. And there were observations that this platform was mostly inhabited by white avatars. And there were rumors going around that moderators of this environment actually discriminated against Afro-American looking avatars. So people got together and organized an online swarm and staged an occupation of this kind of space by producing very stereotypical African-American looking avatars with big afros, with Armani suits, who blocked the entrances to all the entrances, the important social activities on this social media environment. And when people tried to enter the pool, for example, they played with cliches by saying, "Pools closed due to AIDS." So it's a play with stereotypes, with racial stereotypes that functions to contest racism, to challenge racism in this environment, and very obvious function of identity play here. And finally, a more mundane example, it's Pride season, and we can see that social media filters can work to queer our own identities, however we might define our own sexualities or gender identities. We can temporarily queer our identities to be part or to make a case for a more open, more tolerant society, to express solidarity. And in doing so, we temporarily also partly change our identities by taking a political stance and engaging also in this kind of identity play relating to sexuality. So through these examples, we can see that a digital politics of presence that is part of a politics of becoming allows us to engage in identity politics, but a new kind of identity politics that is transformative and that is open to performing the multiple self. So finally, and this is my closing thought here, we're living in a world that's quite literally on fire, right? So we have huge problems with the climate disaster, with huge economic inequality around the world, with erupting wars, and so on. So what role does a politics of becoming play in the context of these huge, very material challenges that we face? And here I make a case for indeed connecting self-transformations to large-scale societal transformations. We need to articulate bold visions of radical democracy that take on these big challenges. And I look at universal basic income, for example, as one example of large economic distribution, the distribution of economic resources that needs to be at the heart of a larger progressive movement. And I see the politics of becoming as part of this progressive movement. And the connection is made here through the idea of a democratic microverse. So I think that our personal transformations are always connected, or at least potentially connected, to these large-scale transformations that our societies so urgently need. If we are bold enough to transform ourselves momentarily, to engage in this kind of interruption and becoming somebody else, we can also start thinking about how can we interrupt the bigger order. How can we transform societies as such? So if we engage in these self-transformations and we constitute these democratic microverses by getting together with other like-minded people or not like-minded people, by constituting democratic spaces, all these kind of participatory spaces we looked at, they all constitute a kind of democratic microverse. So if we look at, again, at the various examples here that we looked at, we can see how they project a certain kind of future, how they prefigure how societies at large should look like, not how societies are now, but how societies should be. Then I encourage you and all of us to engage in these kind of micropolitics, to constitute these democratic microverses, and to actively let them prefigure, let them project a certain democratic future that we all hope for, and engage in these larger scale societal transformations. So at this point, I would like to close. Again, the book is open access, so get a copy if you're interested at all. I'm really grateful for your patience, for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to any questions, any comments, and to a lively conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. I was looking for a reaction button, but we don't have that in this webinar. So here's my analog applause. As I mentioned before, I put the link to Hans's book in the chat, so please feel free to download it. I will share it in a moment again. And I'm also leaving a note, so if participants have questions, ideas, comments, things you would like to discuss, things that came to your mind when listening to Hans' presentation, please feel free to put them on the chat, or you can use the tool to raise your hand, and then we can invite you on screen to have a conversation with us. So the floor is open for questions, for ideas. So please go ahead and share with us. We have our first question. Nikki Johnson, I will now invite you to come on screen.
Hi, yeah, good morning. I'm Nikki Johnson. I'm a professor at the Universidad de la República in Montevideo, Uruguay. I work mainly on questions of feminist democratic politics. So I was very interested to hear about this seminar and to hear the presentation of your book, which I've already downloaded, so I'll be interested in reading it. My question is about, because I agree with you that the politics of presence was a concept that was very useful initially for creating inclusion in terms of creating greater equality. In Latin America in particular, this translated into the adoption of quota laws and parity laws, for which had an enormous impact, is having an enormous impact in women's access to political power, to formal political posts. Now, it's also problematic because it's constructed on a binary idea of gender, where parity is about intercalating men and women on electoral lists. But as has been posited by other scholars, and also your concept of the politics of becoming signal, we do not have single identities, and it also uncovers or makes invisible the different multiple divisions within the group of women. So some women have been given access and other women have not. So poorer women from different from ethnic minorities, for example, have not been given an advantage in terms of the application of affirmative actions. So my question to you is, how can the politics of becoming make those formal political institutional spaces more democratic? Because I see it working at the grassroots level, but how do we deal with these institutions that have been so resistant to change and are, male, heteronormative, ageist, etc.? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. We have plenty of time, so Hans, I would invite you to answer this question directly. And in the meantime, to the other participants, if anyone else has a question or a comment they would like to share, again, please use the chat box or raise your hand. And then after Hans's answer, I can invite you on screen to share with us. Hans, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikki. That was such a fantastic question. And I'm thinking about it. So one thing is, I'm actually, I'm a fan of quotas. I think they are the right solution in the context that we have now. And I don't think there's actually anything incompatible with quotas, parliamentary quotas, for example, and a politics of becoming. And Jane Mansbridge already made this point in Should Women Represent Women and Black Represent Blacks? She said that one important answer to the essentializing function of quotas is a discourse that need to explain the contingency of identities and the performativity of identities, right? So quotas are a good solution, or at least a temporary, even if problematic solution, as long as we understand them as something performative, right? It is important for marginalized people to step into the public sphere, into the formalized spaces, and to claim their embodied identities. So I think one answer is and that is exactly the rereading that the politics of becoming suggests, that originally Connolly already suggests, of identity politics, right? We can see that those instances, let's say, when women through women quotas are talking in parliament, we can see that as a performative act, but we need to not naturalize it or essentialize it, but we need to understand that there's a performance happening. There's a certain assemblage that this woman in this instance is bringing together to perform a certain version of herself in that instance to represent. So that's one answer to the question. And the other answer is that, of course, I mean, my focus for radical democracy is not on these formal representative institutions. And we need to combine those with the various other democratic spaces. And we need to give other democratic spaces, such as social movement spaces, invited spaces, more space in democracy, more importance in democracy. And the answer is always, in my understanding, not to find the ideal space that we can then idealize and, that becomes the paramount of everything, and we just need this space anymore. My answer is a diversity of spaces, right? It needs the different configurations, the different spatial configurations that allow us to perform different versions of ourselves. So that might entail online and offline and hybrid spaces, that also entails anonymity, more clear, means of anonymity through masking, or online anonymity, and spaces where there's less anonymity. So it's the different kind of spaces that allow us to perform different versions of ourselves. And the formal spaces are an important part, but not the most important part of that. And we need to understand our identities contingently and performatively in these spaces as well.
Thank you, Hans, for your reply. While we wait for other participants to come forward with questions, comments, and ideas, I have a connected comment, actually. So if that's okay, I would also like to jump in with an observation and maybe a reflection. So I was caught up a little bit with the moment when you were speaking about Rancia and the idea of interruption. And I think throughout your presentation and in your book, you draw on a lot of examples that come from social movements and protests, right? So you see these performative identities taking place, these changes in identities taking place within this public sphere, coming into the public sphere as part of social movements. And I think I've raised this point before even. You usually take the example of more progressive movements, right? But when you were talking about this identification, I really like that you highlight these contradictory functions of anonymity, right? So you had inclusion, exclusion, subversion, submission, honesty, deception. And I wanted to ask, from the broader perspective of democratic theory, how do you account for this ambivalence? Do you see this as an essential component of democracy, that there is, so to say, not a substantive direction or in a more progressive direction that democracies should go, but rather that the democratic space, the core is empty, and then it can be any of these ambivalent things? Or how do you account for these more also regressive functions of digital politics, of digital presence and anonymity? And before you answer, I will pass the word to you again, but again, please, to our other participants, don't be shy, come forward with questions. We are here to have an open conversation. Hans, to you.
Thank you. That's such an important point. That is so, it's a tricky point, and it's a really crucial one. So I think one answer at least might be that there is a struggle at the heart of democracy itself, right? And at least in my understanding, democracy brings together the two ideals of freedom and equality. And those two ideals are not always easily compatible, right? And that's something that Chantal Mouffe argues about in her democratic paradox, right? There's a paradox at the heart of democracy. Democracy and freedom are not necessarily compatible, because freedom allows us to do everything. Freedom allows us to engage in many things that are not. Freedom is a democratic ideal, but sometimes freedom can be used to limit other people's freedoms, right? Or freedom can be used to inflict harm on other people. So there's something very problematic with freedom. And there's where equality comes in, right? Equality is this idea everybody should have the same opportunities should have, kind of like the same standing, the same respect in democratic spaces. And this is not always compatible with freedom, because freedom can inflict these kind of harms. The book focuses on freedom and equality at the same time, but maybe one focuses on freedom because I think that's maybe something that's a bit that's a bit under theorized in the feminist argument, right? The feminist original argument of the politics of presence really focuses on equality. So my question is, how can we have this freedom to produce, to live the multiple self? And here, of course, anonymity, that's where anonymity's contradictory character or ambivalent character, I think, comes from, because anonymity affords freedom, mainly freedom, not equality. That's why I say, like, all these 6 components, the 3 contradictory freedoms, they're all freedoms. So when we engage in hate speech or in submission to dominant orders or in deception, we do this because we are freer to do so through anonymity. Anonymity allows us, makes us freer to engage in anti-democratic actions. So here, we cannot really, at least I couldn't think of a way. I'd be very happy to hear from someone else who picks this line of thinking up. How can we go beyond these contradictory, this ambivalent character of anonymity, of democracy in a way itself? I see there is always a struggle, and we can simply deal with this problem, live with the tension, and try to, to develop these institutional settings or the structural settings that allow us to combine freedom and equality, and that tries to avoid the kind of anti-democratic behaviors that anonymity and freedom more generally also allows for and encourages.
Thank you very much for your answer. We have a question that came in through the Q&A form, and it was sent anonymously, so I will read it aloud. But if the participant sent it anonymously, maybe without intending to do so, I also want to invite you again to just use the button to raise your hand, and then you can ask the question on screen, or if maybe you cannot talk right now because of noise or something like that, then you can still let us know in the chat, just in case the anonymity was unintended, but maybe it was intended, maybe it was in line with the topic today. So the first question we have is whether becoming and self-transformation is likely to happen for certain groups, and I assume not for others. So for instance, the person posing the question says, I was thinking of age. Would younger people have differences compared with older people within your framework, Hans? And then we have a second question by Paul Emilianovitz. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Paul, if you'd like, we can also put you on the call. If you raise your hand, I can only actually bring you in the call if you raise your hand. So if you'd like to pose your question live, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I can read it for you. Okay, so in the meantime, I think I will just read it. Childcare. No problem, Paul. Thank you so much for letting us know. So a second question that came into the Q&A from Paul Emilianovitz. How do we reconcile the political potential of disidentification and the politics of becoming with the realities of private ownership of the technologies that mediate this becoming? I think this is a very relevant question. How are you thinking through the connections to colonial infrastructures of extraction and relationality, in which provides the material resources that allows for some of us in the world to become something new in this digital space, while not providing the same opportunity to all? What are the anti-colonial and anti-capitalist dimensions of this politics? Is there one? So 2 very provocative questions, Hans. I think I will now give the floor to you. Then we can have more questions.
I love both of these questions. Thank you so much. They're so relevant, and I think they're actually really connected, which is probably coincidental. So the question of, are certain people privileged maybe in transforming their identities, and are certain identity types more adaptable in a way. And I'm sure they are, right? And then if we think in the assemblage framework, we can think about the many components, and they are partly physical, right? So if we bring the idea of age, they might be partly physical, how our bodies, look after a while, but then they are also discursive, how we construct the idea of age, the idea of aging, the idea of these looks. And there's so much potential for transformation if we rethink these concepts, right? If we find beauty, for example, I feel like we live in an ageist culture that discriminates against, let's say, wrinkles, let's say older looking skin, but we can find beauty in older looking skin and reinterpret that. So there are many things that we can shift around. There are things that people do. I mean, people say that they can, you are as young as you feel or as old as you feel. There are life changes, right? I've seen fathers who had a very, kind of like settled life, who after their children grow up, go out and party again and go to raves and, take whatever party drugs that make them happy. So there are many things I feel like that we can do to transform our identities, by reinterpret them, by living in a different way, by assembling our different components in a different, the components of our identities in a different way. But I'm sure that different identity categories are more or less prone to becoming, to changing, to transformation. So then connectedly, Paul's question is so important about the whole capitalist infrastructure that we are building these, and colonial infrastructure that we are building these ideas of a politics of becoming on. And that's deeply problematic. And again, it's a tension that we cannot overcome, that at least not easily, right? So all these ideas of the early cyber democratic ideas of, we go online, we're completely free, and also the more recent Saborgian ideas of we're transforming ourselves by rereading our bodies through the digital, the anti-capitalist Occupy movements online, or online protests online, right? They're anti-capitalist, but they're done and performed on a capitalist infrastructure. Right, so there's this neoliberal background infrastructure that we need to use to engage in these kinds of politics, and that's simply deeply problematic. So what my bigger argument, which is a bit visionary, is it's not a clear answer on how to get there, but at least I'm making the argument, which I think many people just look or neglect or ignore, is that there are these deep societal inequalities and exploitative modes of producing, that are at the heart actually of producing these identities, and we need to challenge them. We need to connect our self-transformations to bigger societal transformations. We need to think about concrete things like basic income, like redistributing work. I mean, we are in about 10 years already, we're going to be sharing our living spaces and our democratic spaces with robots, and they're already all around us. That will mean huge things for how work is divided, and we need to completely redistribute work, and we need to be visionary, we need to be bold. We're in a moment of detrimental crisis, so we need to be bold also as academics. I'm speaking here a little bit, also to fellow academics. I feel like we need to ask the big questions. We need to do our part as academics in society in, if our career position at least allows us to be bold enough to ask the big questions, to articulate the normative views that we have, and to invite others to join us in the movement. And I see us very much as democratic theorists, as democracy scholars, as part of a movement towards more radical democracies, towards more equal societies. And we need to do our part, I think.
Thank you, Hans, for that very inspiring answer. I want to take the opportunity to actually congratulate you, because I didn't when you finished the lecture, but congratulations also on the book coming out, because I think one of the big contributions of this book, and one of the reasons maybe also why you received this early career award, is because you are going back to the big questions. You are going back to these bodies of knowledge that have been somewhat displaced in mainstream political science, so focused on databases and quantitative analysis, which are also sometimes asking the big questions. But I think the work that you're doing is really commendable, in that you bring back the thinking about concepts and how concepts shape our reality. So I think your answer was really, really demonstrating the power that concepts can have in how we see and transform our realities, and the power that we as academics have in how we treat those concepts, which concepts we put forward, and with what conceptual load. I will open the floor again for more questions. Again, please feel free to write them in the chat. You can use the Q&A tool if you would like to do them anonymously, or you can raise your hands. We still have some minutes at least to have a conversation. If there are no more questions or comments or ideas, I think we can still begin to wrap up. But Hans, before we go, I have one last question that I want to pose. And this is a more concrete and institutional question. Much like you, I also work mostly in the field of deliberative and participatory democracy. And while you were presenting, I think, of course, your this book particularly, and much of your work as well, is very rooted on democratic theory and democratic theorizing. But I was thinking when you were presenting, okay, but what are the implications of these ideas that you're putting forward, and thinking about identities as becoming and not as fixed objects and so on, thinking about this tension between freedom and equality? What are the consequences for public policy? What are the consequences for democratic innovation? So I wanted to invite you to maybe say a few words about how, for instance, democratic innovations can account for these shifting identities, how public policy can account for these shifting identities, right? So just to draw an example, if some of our participants maybe are not necessarily from this field, one very now very popular institutional design are citizens' assemblies, where regular citizens are invited, are randomly selected by lot to participate in these assemblies, where they can advise decision makers on political decisions, right? And these participants are selected on the basis of demographic markers, age, gender, income, literacy. But these markers are very tied to fixed identities, and to even identities that come fixed from outside, right? So identities that make part of census, identities that make part of how the state understands us as individuals. At the same time, democratic innovations really want to subvert that top-down order, right? Really want to give that power of decision-making and making politics back to citizens. How or can democratic innovations create those spaces without going back to these fixed identities? That is one question. And before we go, I mean, I would say we can close maybe at 5:15, but before we go, we have another question in the Q&A by Theodora Broyd, who thanks for the inspiring presentation, and also wants to ask, how do you see the future of the nation state and ethnicity, if disidentification and transformations are seen as subversive to the nation state, which I think is even connected to the question that I just posed. So I will give the floor to you with yet again 2 very difficult questions, and then we can wrap this up.
Yeah, the difficult questions come in the end when you already feel you're off the hook. Great questions again. For democratic innovations concretely, I mean, on the one hand, I think Politics of Becoming invites us to rethink democratic innovations profoundly and think about, on the one hand, the diversity of spaces, which I think one fault or one flaw of the democratic innovations field, at least currently, is really the huge focus on these kind of citizens' assemblies, mini publics, as the solution to all our problems, right? And they're not, and we know that, of course. So I feel like the earlier study of democratic innovations that focused on participatory budgets, open assemblies, all these kind of different formats has a lot to offer by showing us the diversity of different spaces that allow us to perform different identities. Then, of course, we also have to start thinking within these spaces how we can allow for a more diverse expression of identities. And of course, quota regulations are problematic. In parliaments, I feel like they are less problematic because you are invited as a representative of a certain group, right? So that's your job as a representative in parliament per job definition. But in a citizens' assembly, you are invited as a citizen, and when then it turns out you're showing there up there actually as the one of the two representative of migrants or of female migrants, let's say, right? Then you're essentialized in that setting, and that is very problematic. So one way of going about this is to rethink of invitation policies. And here Marta Wojciechowska has a great paper on intersectionality and democratic innovation. So please go and find this paper. There are better answers than I can give here. But let me just give a very small example. There are, for example, I experienced it at the last APSA conference and international conference. When I entered the conference, at the very beginning at the registration table, there were buttons that you could take for free that define your pronouns, right? So you could in that moment choose if you're he, him, they, them, her, hers, she, hers. So you can play around with these kind of things of choosing your definition of the moment, choosing your name. Is an important thing. Like, let's think of the politics of naming. Who is giving names? Who is choosing their own names? How do we deal with the names in these kinds of spaces? Those are little things we can play around with. But overall, we also need to rethink the structures of these spaces and the diversity of these spaces. So the nation state question is a difficult one, because if we think, and here I'm going back to Marquis Bay's work on Black trans feminism, and Bay really connects this idea, and actually Sheldon Wallen already does that in his much earlier paper on fugitive democracy, right? Both of them connect the idea of identities as something confining to the idea of the state as something confining, and the state borders as something very confining, right? And I just give one example because it just made Rancière and his whole surveillance idea of the police so real for me. When I'm working in Australia now, and when I entered Australia to get my work visa, I was currently in Austria in Europe. I had to take a physical exam with a doctor of the Australian government's choice, right? And the exam results of my health were directly transmitted to the Australian government, right? So it's this kind of borders that are very firm, and we often, probably most of us in this digital space here now, have privileged identities, privileged positions in societies, and we might experience less how difficult it can be to cross borders, as nation-state borders. But there are big hurdles in place, and there is this kind of surveillance in place as well. So if we consequentially follow Marquis Bay, they propose an anarchist view of abolishing these kind of borders, and that would have huge implications of how societies would work, how the world order would work, and this is just a vision and it's not a concrete answer. But I'm a fan of this kind of thinking. I think it's very inspiring, and I think we can draw on anarchist thinking as well in thinking about radical democracy as a grassroots thing that transforms, and the kind of borders that are in place may inhibit these kind of transformations and encounters worldwide. So a vague answer, but at least something that we hopefully can think about together more in the future.
Thank you very much, Hans. This is the last call for any final questions, comments, or ideas that anyone might want to share, because otherwise I think we are ready to wrap up. Once again, thank you, Hans, for presenting your upcoming book with us. As I mentioned before, you can find the link in the chat. The book is open access, and it's already available for download at Hans's ResearchGate page, but it will also be available for download or purchase at Oxford University Press's website very soon. Thank you to ECPR also for opening up this space, for giving us the possibility of listening to you present the book, of sharing this lecture with us. Thank you to the participants for your provocative questions, and let's continue the conversation in other spaces.
Yeah, can I also just say thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you, Melisa. This was brilliant hosting. And I just, yeah, you have so many kind words for me. I feel a bit embarrassed. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are. Have a nice one. Thank you. See you around.